We're the Mesopotamians. Sargon, Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal, and Gilgamesh.
In this video, we'll be discussing the Mesopotamians. So, how were the Mesopotamians influenced by their environment? Second, what caused the formation of the first states in Mesopotamia, and how did they change over time? Third, how did the development of legal systems in Mesopotamia support social hierarchies? And fourth, how did the development of cultural traditions help further unify Mesopotamia? So the first question, how are the Mesopotamians influenced by their environment? So Mesopotamia, that term has Greek roots. Meso means middle. Potamia means river. So Mesopotamia is the land between the rivers. And the rivers in Mesopotamia are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And those rivers had a huge impact on the development of Mesopotamian society. So Mesopotamia is located in the modern-day countries of Iraq and Syria in the Middle East. And so a lot of stuff is happening in the news in this particular region. In northern Iraq and western Syria, we have the Islamic State, ISIS. ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And tragically, this is what's happening in this region to many of the Mesopotamian artifacts, is ISIS is taking sledgehammers to them and saws to them and destroying them. Now, what could be the reason? Why might ISIS, it's like you can't even watch. It makes me vomit in my mouth. But why is ISIS doing this? So ISIS is a fundamentalist group, right? They have certain perverse ideologies about their religion, and one of the things they believe is you cannot worship false idols or gods, and these images oftentimes are images of gods, and therefore they feel the need to destroy them. Unfortunately, in the process, they're also destroying thousands of years of history. Back to the geography again. So Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now these rivers flooded unpredictably and violently. And that's going to become incredibly important a little bit later on. Now, the one positive to flooding is that it allowed for this area to develop some fertile silt. Therefore, it made it very conducive to developing farming. And we saw that this was one of this region right here, the Fertile Crescent in the Eastern Mediterranean, was the first region that developed farming villages. So this region, again, is also called the Fertile Crescent. Now, there's really a lack of geographic barriers in this region, which had the effect of making it susceptible to invasion. So we're going to see in other societies like Egypt and China, we're going to see that they were relatively geographically isolated, and therefore they were able to maintain a pretty continuous political state, versus in the case of Mesopotamia, there was constant invasion from different states, as Mesopotamia really serves as a crossroads for Afro-Eurasia. Now, what caused the formation of the first states in Mesopotamia, and how did they change over time? So Mesopotamia, the very first political states in Mesopotamia were the formation of these cities in a region known as Sumer. City-states like Ur and Eridu and Lagash and Urk and Nippur emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in this region again that was initially referred to as Sumer. So why did the first states, or why did the first governments form in world history? And historians, again, have no single clear answer, but they debate different theories. And oftentimes, these theories revolve around the need for a common defense, the need to develop irrigation systems, things that individuals can't do by themselves, but instead have to rely on a collective group within their society, lead to the formation of the first governments. Now, the formation of the first states were these small, decentralized city-states. And as we'll find out in world history, oftentimes when we're talking about decentralized city-states, that oftentimes also means conflict. But each of these city-states had their own leader. For instance, we have leaders like Gilgamesh here. Now, over time, these city-states eventually would be conquered and lead to the formation of larger states like Akkad, Babylonia, and ultimately even maybe the formation of a larger empire like this Assyrian Empire right here from 911 BCE to 612 BCE. So why did these political states grow over time? Really, it was the result of war and conquest, right? Um, as different societies developed different technologies that allowed them to conquer larger regions. So then larger political organizations formed, such as the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Now, as a result of the importance of military conquest, not surprisingly, it was military leaders who ultimately emerged in society and achieved the most powerful positions and installed themselves as kings with absolute power. Now, where did that power come from? What gave leaders in world history, throughout world history, power and authority? Ultimately, it came from the gods, and the gods were what allowed leaders like Ashurbanipal here to go out and hunt and slay lions. Now, they would ultimately create these images where they're engaging in godlike activities in order to demonstrate their power and show themselves maintaining their power. So this particular image is of the top of Hammurabi's code, and it shows Hammurabi, who's actually located on the left, receiving a staff from one of the local deities. So you can see here kings associating with themselves with gods. And we're going to see this throughout world history as leaders, even still today, leaders like Putin, who, take pictures of themselves riding around on horseback shirtless in order to demonstrate their power. Now, legal codes like Hammurabi's code played a critical role in organizing their society. They're going to reinforce social inequalities between both classes and genders. Which leads to the next question. How did the development of legal systems in Mesopotamia support social hierarchies? Let's first look at the Code of Hammurabi. So in the Code of Hammurabi, one of its provisions state, if a man put out the eye of a nobleman, his eye shall be put out. If he puts out the eye of a man's slave, or breaks the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 of its value. So what does this provision suggest about Mesopotamian society? Well, we can see here that there's different punishments depending on what your social status is. So one thing that we can conclude is that Mesopotamia had a defined and rigid social class system. We can see this as well in the standard of an artifact that we examined earlier on an earlier video, where we see different levels, different tiers of social class standing. So typically when we break down a society, we oftentimes do it in the shape of a pyramid. So at the very top of Mesopotamian society, we had a king or a monarch, and then maybe nobles and priests as well. We have soldiers, craftsmen, laborers, farmers, peasants, and kind of this middle group. And at the very bottom, we could tell from the inscription also that we have slavery that was practiced. Now, how does one become a slave in most of these societies? Well, oftentimes through 3 ways. One, as a prisoner of war, you're given the choice of rather to die or to serve as another man's slave, and many people opted for a life of enslavement. 2, you could be a criminal, and this could be a punishment that's imposed upon you. 3, as a debtor. Oftentimes people sold either themselves or sometimes their own children or their wives into slavery as a way of settling a debt. So let's look at another legal code. This one states, if a woman has spoken to a man of higher rank, her teeth will be smashed by a brick. So this suggests that in Mesopotamian society, clearly defined gender roles were starting to form, and Mesopotamia was a patriarchal society. So in patriarchal societies, men hold positions of political power. Women have few, if any, legal rights. Very rarely are they able to initiate a divorce, for example, or even own property. Women receive no or little education because education is power, and so men want to withhold power from women, and one way they can do that is by limiting their education. And then 4, women are oftentimes required to wear restrictive clothing in public. A good example is the practice of veiling, which dates back to Mesopotamian laws and then gets passed down to other religious traditions such as Christianity and Islam. Now, if we look at Mesopotamia's economic system, we can look at the standard of Ur again and take a look at some of the particular pieces on the standard of Ur. We have blue stone, which was mined exclusively in Afghanistan at the time. We have these red stones, which are mined from India. We have shells from the Persian Gulf. And so what does this suggest? This suggests that Mesopotamians were engaged in trade, trans-regional trade, trade outside the Middle East. So Mesopotamians did not have many natural resources of their own, so they oftentimes traded their one resource that they had in abundance, which was crops, for other goods, such as those rare commodities. So they developed many important technologies, the Mesopotamians did, including the base 60 number system. Now, lest you think that we only use a base 10 number system, can you think of other modern day implications of the base 60 number system? So if you said the number of seconds in a minute or the number of minutes in an hour, that relies again on the base 60 number system, which the Mesopotamians first developed. They also were the first really to develop the wheel and the wheeled vehicle. They developed bronze metallurgy for the first time, moving from copper metal, which was not very reliable, to a more reliable form of metal bronze. But probably most importantly, although it is somewhat debated by historians, they developed writing for the first time. So this leads us to our next big question. How did the development of cultural traditions help unify Mesopotamia? So Mesopotamians developed writing, and their particular form of writing was known as cuneiform. In cuneiform, they took clay tablets and they pressed stylus or wedge into the wet clay tablets. And the very first forms of writing were developed in order to keep records. For instance, the tax collectors within a city would ensure that everyone had paid sufficient taxes. And so cuneiform was developed for that initial purpose, but over time it began being used for wider purposes. So, for example, eventually became used in literature. So one of the very first stories, literary stories in world history is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells the story of a Mesopotamian king and all of the kind of crazy adventures and accomplishments of that particular king. Now, the Mesopotamians, in terms of their cultural traditions, were polytheists. They worshiped multiple gods. Those gods were oftentimes a reflection of spirits and nature. So they built these monumental pieces of architecture, the kings did, in order to display their power and also to, recognize a connection with the gods. So they built these ziggurats, these monumental temples to their gods. Now, this should look somewhat familiar to you because in a very similar way, the Egyptians would later build their pyramids. Egyptian pharaohs would build their pyramids as temples to their gods. Now, their gods were mean, moody, and random, the Mesopotamians. We stop and think about why might that be. Now, if their gods are connected to nature, and their environment was, as we recall about the rivers, unpredictable, random, the flooding would occur, and unpredictable patterns. That suggests that the gods were a reflection of their understanding of their own natural world and in their own environment. And we can see this in their view of their afterlife. It was very dark, it was very pessimistic, it was very gloomy. People who went to the afterlife had nothing to eat or drink but dust. And we'll be able to compare this to the outlook that the Egyptians had toward their gods and towards their afterlife, because we'll be able to note a particular difference there. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching these videos are: 1. How were the Mesopotamians influenced by their environment? 2. What caused the formation of the first states in Mesopotamia, and how did they change over time? 3. How did the development of legal systems in Mesopotamia support social hierarchies? And 4. How did the development of cultural traditions help unify Mesopotamia? Thanks for watching.